moment. A lot of things have happened to me in these moments of revelation. I don't know what it is, whether it's an Asian Canadian thing, which is a kind of historic moment, but moments of revelation. It was the summer of 1970. I'm reading 2 paragraphs from a collection of essays that I've just completed and to be published by New West Press this fall. It was the summer of 1970. It was the year of Expo 70 in Osaka. I was sauntering along a street in Asakusa in Tokyo. I was drawn to the insistent rhythm of a barker's voice. A tightly knit crowd had cohered around him. Entering that circle, my imagination suddenly shuttled back and forth from the voice to the site of the Royal American Show in my Winnipeg childhood. There, at least for a normal kid, the barkers were mesmerizing for the uncanny ability they had to perform a constant stream of talk, sort of like professors. That's why I first got to be desired to be a professor when I heard these barkers. They could just keep talking. It just seems so amazing to me. These people have this language. I fantasized that one day I too might be able to perform so fluently in the English language. But it wasn't only the voice that attracted me, it was also its discursive calling into appearance the object of its gaze, the so-called freak show. Here were men and women doing wondrous feats, such as swallowing a sword or breathing fire, but alongside them were others whose bodies were the spectacle, the objects displayed for their own divergences from the normative gaze. The fattest or tallest person in the world, the bearded woman, twins whose bodies were joined, the limbless body. In the crowd at Asakusa, among the normative bodies there, my own invisibility took on some uncanny effects. Without thought, I found myself slipping into the barker's world, anticipating the gaze, enticed by the sample others, so familiar from childhood, yet so alien in Japanese bodies, displayed on a makeshift stage beside him. Those bodies, acting as what memory theorist Daniel Schachter has called a retrieval cue, struck a deep chord of an estrangement located in my own body's memory. It was the ease with which, 16 months after moving to Tokyo, I could enter the language and pass in a critical space that began to warp in my imagination. Against the Japanese-identified bodies that made the kid growing up in Winnipeg visible, I was transparent in the Asakusa crowd. But instead of feeling relaxed by the ability to comprehend, the act of slipping into the barker's voice made me conscious of my own displacement in the crowd. The translation process that allowed the barker's voice to be folded into the remembered childhood moment disrupted my consciousness of the scene, exposing what might be described in Roland Blanker's provocative terms as, quote, a discursive void, which is kind of what Kirsten was talking about, a discursive void. The space where multiple and overlapping discourses clash, where silent and sometimes not so silent arguments are exchanged, where boundaries are drawn and redrawn, unquote. As the barker's voice trailed on, there I was on a warm and pleasant Saturday afternoon, utterly immersed in the memory of a racialized, hence freakish as well, body that haunted my childhood in Winnipeg. And it was that moment in the circus crowd that I suddenly realized that I was never going to be Japanese. And that this whole thing of trying and desiring to be Japanese, to be part of that whole Japanese culture, was really a fake moment. But at the same time, I didn't feel that I was Canadian myself. But at the same time, I felt so displaced, this discursive void. And it was a really provocative moment and really creative moment for me, because it sort of said, get off your ass, boy. Get on with your life. Because up until that point, I had fantasized about doing all this kind of graduate work in Asian studies, doing this, and getting a PhD and doing all these things. I realized that there was this incredible amount of work that had to be done in the Canadian context, and it had to do with locating this notion of the Asian Canadian as an actual discursive space, whatever that might be constituted of. And interestingly, when I returned to Canada in '71, my wife and I were gone for 2 years. Thank you. I'd gone for 2 years. When we returned to it, multiculturalism had come into being. And it was interesting because I moved into this space again, and before we left, I felt alien, and when I got back, I felt multicultural. Yeah. And no, it wasn't Woodstock that did it. Woodstock happened at the same time, but that was also a turning point, right, at that period. And when we came back, there was a different social space, and people were now talking about Japanese Canadian as an ethnicity, not as a racialized identity, but as an ethnicity. And, oh, it's too bad what happened to you, to Japanese Canadians, and so on. And Japanese Canadians themselves began to rebuild their own histories through the 70s, and led to the centennial in 1977. And that period was a time of reclaiming histories, reclaiming identity. So,
because you talked about when we discussed what is Asian Canadian at this moment and its movement, because one of the things I think for me in the research that I've done with the community is realizing that it was actually a community of activists, a generation. So when I started working in the community in 1990, I came in when the redress movement had ended.
yeah.
And everyone was already saying the community has ended. There's no more purpose for the Japanese Canadians to work together as a community. So there was this great nostalgia back to the 70s. And it wasn't just Japanese Canadian subjects, there were coalitions. So it was this work that emerged, and now we see the remnants of this activism, whether it's Total or what's that, not the Yellow Peril, the rice, inalienable rice. Yeah, so these different sort of textual remnants.
Asian-cdn too as a magazine.
And we don't necessarily realize the majority of the activity that was happening that made these remnants possible.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you could talk about that space of, because in some ways I romanticize that period, the 70s.
Yeah, the 70s were pretty interesting, although I always thought of them as the most boring decade in the world because music and culture and things. There was a lot of horrible things happening in the 70s, like the recession hit in the early 70s and the oil crisis and all these kinds of things, and huge amounts of funding that were available in the 60s were cut back. At the same time, as white culture was going through its own trauma, it was kind of interesting. There was this emergence of these voices from minority communities. I remember when the Assembly of First Nations first formed in and around and against the White Paper, 1969, when the of Indian Affairs came out with this white paper in which and it wasn't meant to be raced. They called it the white paper, but it had nothing to do with race. But the white paper was announcing that Aboriginal communities ought to be disassembled and Native Aboriginals ought to be assimilated. So they were wanting to disband all the band councils and things like that. So Aboriginal communities all banded together in resistance to it, and out of it came the Assembly of First Nations. I remember that was an amazing moment. People like Lee Miracle were writing amazing autobiographies, and there were others in the mix, and other communities. And I don't know whether you remember the W5 crisis with Chinese Canadians. Well, out of that crisis, when the W5 panned the universities in BC and said these are our campuses are taken over by Asian students, they found out that they were all Chinese Canadians who were born in Canada, and so they were Canadian. So out of that, the Chinese Canadian National Council formed. It constituted itself in response to this crisis. So there were things like this were happening around us, and I remember one of the key moments for me, and it seems so simple and silly now, right? Is this notion of decolonization. People were borrowing the discourse of post-colonialism and colonialization, and they were applying it to feminist thought, to minority thought, and there's this big concept of internal decolonization occurred, and internalized racism. It seems silly to you because we take it for granted now, internalized racism, oh yeah, internalized racism. But there's a certain moment in which that became a concern when people had a particular language to say, aha, so that's what's wrong with us. We've been colonized internally through discourses. And in order to undo this colonization, we needed to begin to attack the discourses that created our subjectivities. That was a key moment in the anti-racist movement of the early 80s. And then you get the emergence of a new language, the language of color. I remember when black feminist writers in the United States, I think, were the first ones to begin to say, we are women of color. And everybody go, what does that mean, women of color? You know, and people make fun of color, and they say, you're just race people. Why are you using this kind of language to speak yourself? But it's an interesting concept because it shifted the boundaries of discourse, and it opened up